Tom Shattuck of the Lowell Sun here with Christopher Scott of the Lowell Sun. We are very pleased to introduce Andrew Yang, running for president. Andrew, good afternoon.
Thanks, guys. It's great to be in touch.
Andrew, you know what? I want to start somewhere. We'll get to UBI and all that stuff, but I want to start somewhere more cultural. Did you see the Golden Globes Sunday?
I watched a very small piece of it from Iowa.
And, you know, everybody's angry, at least in the coast of Ricky Gervais, for kind of taking people to task or trying to bring them down a notch. What was your take on what he said?
You know, it's up to the organization. I mean, they freaking hired him multiple times. They kind of know what kind of comedian he is. And it is comedy. So, you know, I'd put it up to a matter of taste.
So I ask about that because there are a lot of people and a lot of conservatives who first started to know you because culturally you were a little bit different. Culturally, you were a little bit different than everybody else. So, for instance, things like cancel culture with Ellen DeGeneres, when she was somebody took a picture of her with George W. Bush. You know, people, the pitchforks were out. And everybody took their sides, but you were down the middle. You kind of made it okay to talk to people, to acknowledge that people are fallible. And I mean, you've been on Dave Rubin, I think. You've been on a lot of those guys in the international dark web or whatever you want to call it. Where did you get this philosophy? And it's new to politics.
Well, it's unfortunate that it is new to politics. To me, it's obvious that you're going to have a hard time persuading anyone to your point of view if you're not willing to talk to them, and that it's going to be very hard to bring our country together to solve problems that affect us all if you decide that 40% of Americans are somehow not worth talking to or not worth your time. So it makes me sad that this is somehow new to politics, but we have to solve the real problems on the ground in our communities. And unfortunately, they're growing bigger all the time.
Democratic strategists would tell you, listen, Andrew, you got to step in line on this stuff because you've got a primary to win. You have to appeal to the base. So pile on. How do you ignore those voices?
Well, number one, you have to run as yourself. I think trying to be something other than what you are, or some other person, some consultant, trained version of a candidate. Would be a sure path to disaster. And two, I don't believe that most Democrats or most Americans subscribe to some of these beliefs or stances as much as the media or very visible people on social media would have one believe.
So who are you talking to then? If you don't appear to be in a bubble or an echo chamber then, who is it that you're hanging out with where you're able to talk like people?
Well, that's the great thing about campaigning in a place like New Hampshire is you go to people where they are, you talk to them like Americans and human beings, and you find that most everyone is very reasonable. Everyone wants to solve problems that affect us and our kids. The fact that we have record high levels of substance abuse and mental health problems in New Hampshire, even more so than some of the other parts of the country. The fact that we have a healthcare system that's breaking our backs because prices only go up and up. I went to high school in New Hampshire, and I always knew that the people there were going to be very reasonable and not subscribe to some of the more extreme points of view that are, again, out there on social media.
Before we get to some of the harder issues, I had somebody from Massachusetts who, when he found out we were talking to you, say, ask me about the Shane Gillis thing. And Shane Gillis, of course, was going to be on SNL and then said or he had a podcast that was very blue or racist, whatever you want to call it. And he insulted you in it, I guess, as well, but you offered to have a conversation with the guy. Did that happen, one? And two, what did you talk about?
Yeah, we did talk. We had a good, frank, off-the-record conversation. I was on the record saying I did not think that he should lose his job. Again, it's comedy. And as the person who was personally insulted and called out, I thought I had a particular role and responsibility, or opportunity, really, to let people know that turning on each other is not productive, even if someone says something that you find offensive in a comedic context. And one person said it to me best, where if you're angry at someone and say they should lose their job, a week later, you might have forgotten all about it, but that person still doesn't have their job.
Andrew, I'm going to hand you over here to Christopher Scott. He's the editor here for the Lowell Sun as well. And obviously, our reaches in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. Take it away, Chris.
Hi, Andrew. How are you? Thank you for coming on today.
Happy to be here, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Yep, and I just want to say I love your name. That's my son's name as well. So I'd like to just segue into something that Tom mentioned. I remember when I watched the first Democratic debate.
You named your son Yang? I'm just kidding.
Yeah. When I watched the first debate, I said to my wife, Who is this Yang guy? And I was pretty impressed. And weeks later, you're still in the race where some other well-known political figures that were once on the same stage as you are now out. I would like you to be very specific and tell us what has enabled you to remain in this race where some well-known senators have already gotten out and there'll probably be a couple more that leave before some others. Try to be specific. Is it just that what you were talking about earlier, your willingness to engage and speak with anybody and not harbor enemies? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
We've had a consistent message from day one that has fueled our campaign's rise while other candidates have fallen by the wayside. And that message is that we need to solve the problems that got Donald Trump elected that we can all see in our communities every day. We blasted away 4 million manufacturing jobs in the swing states, and now 30% of stores and malls are closing because Amazon is soaking up $20 billion in business every year and paying zero in taxes. We have to make this economy work for everybody and make it so that all Americans feel included in our continued progress and innovation. And that message has been growing louder and clearer all of the time. You can't have trillion-dollar tech companies like Amazon paying zero into our society and have the other tech companies selling and reselling our data over and over again while we don't see a dime. Mm-hmm. This is not the way that people will be excited about the path moving forward for us and our kids. And so I've been laser focused on solving these problems on the ground, mm-hmm. And doing so in a way that Americans can understand that it's not about ideology. And people have been responding to it.
You were in the news and the headlines just earlier this month or late last month about the most recent fundraising numbers where, if my memory is correct, you raised about $16 or $17 million in the last quarter. And that raised a few eyebrows, as that's quite a haul. How much money do you think you need to raise to stay in this race? And talk a little bit about that $16, $17 million. Iowa's coming up. New Hampshire is coming up. How are you moving forward with that 16 and 17 million?
Well, if you're in New Hampshire, hopefully you've seen where some of the money's going, which is to TV ads in New Hampshire and Iowa. We have the resources to compete all through primary season, through Super Tuesday and into the spring. And the $16.5 million we raised in the fourth quarter was 65% higher than we raised the previous quarter. We're growing faster than any other campaign in the field. My goal was always to grow and peak at the right time, and it looks like that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to peak when the voting starts in February.
A quick question about Iowa and New Hampshire, two very white states. Do you think that they ought to retain their status as first in the nation primary and caucus state, or should that somehow be redone where those first states are more reflective of the country's diversity as a whole?
I think it would be very difficult for another place to develop the same kind of political culture and experience that Iowa and New Hampshire have developed over the past number of decades. Where when I interact with voters in New Hampshire, they're comparing me not just to candidates of this cycle, they're comparing me to candidates from 8 or 12 or 20 years ago. And to me, there are different forms of diversity. I found Iowans and New Hampshire voters to be very reasonable and open-minded and able to see beyond their own experiences. I don't have a problem with the process as it is. If someone wanted to suggest an improvement and everyone was excited about that, I'm always for trying to find ways to do things better. But if there was another state that had this kind of pole position, frankly, it would not know what to do. It's taken generations for Iowans and New Hampshire voters to develop their own political cultures.
Okay, fair enough. And I'm just curious, where are you speaking to us from today? Are you in New Hampshire or are you in Iowa? I presume one of the two.
Yeah, it's a very good guess. I am in New York for just 24 hours or less. I'm doing The View tomorrow with my wife.
Oh, okay.
So we stopped over here. But I'll be in New Hampshire tomorrow night. So
right.
I'm going to be in New Hampshire for the next 3 or 4 days. So anyone who wants to come meet me in person, please come on out. I'd love to see you. Like
you said, Andrew, you've gotten, even Republicans are taking a look at you and saying this is a different kind of guy, different kind of candidate. And a lot of it, I think, is that you've got the courage of your own convictions. You're the only guy who sounds like you. And that brings us to this next debate where, because there's been this polling abyss, you haven't reached the criteria needed to get on stage with these other candidates. I think, personally, that is a disgrace. Do you plan on being loud and vocal about this, or kicking down the door, or having your own debate, or are you just going to take it and go out and shake hands?
Well, we're talking to different people about options if we don't make the debate. I'm 100% confident I'd be on that debate stage if there were more early state polls. Mm-hmm. But there have been very, very few polls, almost no polls in almost 2 months in the early states, which really is a farce because we're investing all of our resources in the early states. And so if you don't check what voters think, like how the heck can you see whether there's been any growth or energy? So we have a few alternative plans that we're considering, but I'm happy to say that the reality on the ground is that we're seeing huge crowds in Iowa and New Hampshire, more energy and excitement than ever before. We're going to grow all through January and shock the world in February, regardless of whether we're on this debate stage. I think that this debate may in some ways be the least important because we're so close to voting.
Why are you the candidate that we need right now, this year, and not 4 years from now when you've had more experience under your belt doing this stuff, or even 8 years from now? Why do we need Andrew Yang now?
Time is not on our side. We're going through the greatest economic transformation in our country's history right now, the fourth industrial revolution. Tier 1 just today announced that they're going to close almost 500 stores, which will put thousands of workers out of a job. Artificial intelligence is coming out of the labs and is set to replace 2.5 million call center workers who right now make $14 an hour. The first robot truck just transported cargo cross-country without any human intervention, and driving a truck is the most common job in 29 states. So we can't afford to wait. If we wait for another 4 years, some of these changes will just become more devastating for communities around the country. And our political class is just not up for the challenge. If we waited for D.C. to solve our problems, we'd be waiting forever. We need a different type of leadership and a different approach to improving our way of life than we've been getting out of D.C. for the last several decades.
So do you, is the AI boom, is that a wonderful revolution, or do you put constraints on it so that it doesn't move too fast?
It has the potential to be wonderful if the average American feels like you're gaining from it and winning from it. If artificial intelligence is much more likely to put you out of a job and all of the gains go to these trillion-dollar tech companies that are paying zero in taxes, then it will not feel wonderful. And that is what we have to change. I am very pro-progress and innovation. I like technology, but I like people even more. We have to have the machines working for us rather than the other way around. And that's what we have to change fundamentally very, very quickly.
So it's interesting, and that's where UBI comes in, which is $1,000 a month. So what would let's say you're somebody who lives up in Franconia, New Hampshire, and you are a truck driver, and you notice that more of the trucks are being converted into self-driving automobiles, whatever. Is the idea that you'd get the freedom dividend, and that allows you the freedom to move to a market maybe where there's more trucks or an industry that would that's still flourishing?
The freedom dividend would enable that worker and all of us to more effectively transition. I will say that the trucking industry is so integral to our economy that I would have a special approach to it where the cost savings of adopting self-driving trucks are estimated to be $168 billion a year. We need to take some of that money and put it directly to that trucker in Franconia so that he has a path forward and is not left on his own, because many of these truckers took out loans of tens of thousands of dollars to lease their trucks. Imagine having your life savings tied up in a truck that all of a sudden can't compete against a robot truck that goes on the highway 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But yes, the $1,000 a month would go into that trucker's hands, and let's say that his job is fine for another several years, then he starts to have a bit of a cushion, and then if he decides to make a transition, he can much more effectively do so.
And I'm sure because you've written a book on this, how deep do your projections go? So you lose a truck driver, or the trucking industry. That means nobody's paying insurance anymore, or health insurance for these folks. That also means that along the way, truck stops would be gone. He's not buying 18 Red Bulls to get from Iowa to New Hampshire. How damaging to the infrastructure, the economic infrastructure, is just losing the trucking industry?
It would be catastrophic for hundreds, even thousands of communities around the country. There are 3.5 million truckers and over 7 million Americans who work at the truck stops, motels, and diners that rely upon the truckers stopping every day and having a meal. If you look at the state of Nebraska, almost 10% of jobs in the state support freight. How many of those jobs will still be there when the trucks don't need to stop? So this is a tsunami of historic proportions that's going to sweep away many of the most common jobs in much of the country unless we get our acts together and start making moves now. Unfortunately, our government is like a flopping appendage that is decades behind the curve. We got rid of the Office of Technology Assessment in 1995, 25 years ago. So Congress has been out to lunch on any technology issues for 25 years and counting. They're not going to do anything to stop this. That's why we have to have a different form of leadership. But if you look at the ripple effects from the automation of freight, they are devastating and historic.
Andrew, just as an observation and then a question. We're in Lowell, Massachusetts, which is the fifth largest community in the state. We're on the New Hampshire border, way up in the northeast part of the state. And between us and New Hampshire is a little town called Dracut. And Dracut is home to, I think at last count, maybe 5 or 6 terminals to national trucking companies. They go down Route 113 with quick access to Interstate 93, which I'm sure you've been on your campaign trips through New Hampshire. You might want to consider a trip to Dracut to visit some of those national trucking terminals in the future. The trucking situation, as we just described, is really quite fascinating to me. But the question I have here is, Lowell is about 110,000 population. It's a very diverse city. It's a city that's been able to maintain its middle class while having some inner city neighborhoods that are way below the median income. What would you, as president, do to keep those kinds of cities, those working class cities, on your radar scope?
Well, to me, those towns are the norm in America. One of the problems for the Democratic Party is that it's being perceived more and more as the party of cities. And then people who live in communities around the country that don't resemble the giant metropolises feel like the Democratic Party's not as concerned about them. We have to create a path forward for the people in Lowell and the people in rural New Hampshire that everyone can see and understand and can get excited about. Right now, many communities are getting depleted and sucked dry, and that's going to get worse as this winner-take-all economy accelerates. So the people in Lowell are front and center in my mind, that if this economy is not working for the people in Lowell, it's not working. Mm-hmm. And that has to be what we change together as a country. I spent 7 years working in communities in the Midwest and the South, many of which have never recovered from the automation of the 4 million manufacturing jobs that used to be the lifeblood of those communities. I know how central economic growth and jobs are to any community. Without them, the community fails. And right now, unfortunately, we're putting more and more communities in that position. That's what we have to reverse together as a country as quickly as possible.
Thank you. I'd like to go back to just something you said earlier about your schedule moving forward, that you plan to be in this race right through Super Tuesday and beyond. I'm sure there are some other Democratic candidates who have the same resolve and aggressive nature that you do. I'm beginning to read reports on a possible brokered convention and going right down to the wire. What do the Democrats have to do here to defeat President Trump? And do you ever see the Democratic Party getting behind one candidate with one voice to take on the incumbent who's there now?
The way we defeat Donald Trump is by focusing on the problems that got him elected in the first place and presenting a positive vision that the country can get excited about. Anytime we're talking about Donald Trump himself, we are losing. Donald Trump is a person that thrives on
could go either way,
sort, whether it's positive or negative. So I do believe the Democratic Party will coalesce around the nominee because Democrats are so eager to defeat Donald Trump. And I've spent time with the other candidates, obviously. There's a degree of collegiality that I believe will keep the party unified come November.
I think we've had a great conversation so far, but I can't let this go without asking you this. Do you support the impeachment, or do you think it should have been a censure or something else like that?
I support the Democrats moving forward with impeachment, but I do think that it unfortunately is a costly distraction. I've compared it to a ball game where you already know what the score is going to be. You've had 0 Republicans in the Senate signal that they're interested in impeaching the president. And so this is going to be a giant distraction from the real problems on the ground. It's going to increase polarization and not lead us in the right direction.
So one of the cities that we serve, obviously we're the Fitchburg Sentinel and Enterprise here. It's becoming a major center of cannabis cultivation because of the empty former manufacturing facilities. What efforts would you make to help the cannabis industry grow and prosper here and across the country?
I would legalize marijuana and cannabis at the federal level. It's a much safer way for many Americans to manage their health and pain than many of the other prescription drugs we have that have frankly been killing thousands of Americans over the last number of years. And that would help entrepreneurs who want to build businesses do so in a much more predictable way. I talk to people in the cannabis industry, and there are some very strange hodgepodges of rules that they have to navigate around their banking, their transportation, which markets they can sell to. We need to clean that up. I would legalize marijuana at the federal level. And I would go a step further, and I would pardon everyone who's in jail for a nonviolent marijuana-related offense. They shouldn't be in jail for something that's legal in certain parts of the country.
So one of the things that you advocate for, which I think is just crazy, because both you and I were 16 at one point, is that you want to lower the voting age to 16. Do you think, we're the same age, Andrew, that either of us should have been voting at 16?
Well, here are the arguments for lowering the voting age to 16. Number one, you can pay taxes at 16, so you should have a say in where the money goes. Number two, the earlier you vote, the more likely you are to vote throughout your lifetime. Number three, it transforms high schools into places where people would actually feel like citizens and they have a say in the future. Number four, you're going to be here longer, so you should probably also have some say in what we're doing. The argument against is that 16-year-olds are too immature and ill-informed to be able to vote. And the fact is that we have Americans voting all over the country who wouldn't be able to pass a pop quiz if we sprung it on them before they pulled the lever.
True.
So there's some very, very savvy and informed 16-year-olds, and there are some very immature ones. But you could say the same thing about people at every age and stage. It's not that age somehow makes you, the paragon of news consumption. So, so to me, the pros outweigh the cons significantly, and so I would advocate for it.
And another one that also surprises me, but for another reason that Republicans are all thrilled about, is that you're for leaving the minimum wage up to the states, which is, it's Milton Friedman-esque of you.
Well, I'm for putting $1,000 a month in everyone's hands because that would elevate the effective minimum wage for everyone and would recognize the kind of work that my wife does at home with our two boys, one of whom is autistic, and all of the other unrecognized, uncompensated work in our society. I've also run a small business, and I know many small businesses would be forced to cut back shifts if we were to elevate the minimum wage to $15 an hour or some other level. All of that said, I don't think people should be working full time and be poor. So if I had no other alternative, I would explore trying to get money into people's hands through their income. But it's better just to put it directly in their hands, because if you put $1,000 a month into everyone's hands, then that is an unambiguous win for every small business, because all of a sudden your customers have more money. Whereas if you just elevate the minimum wage, you're putting the pressure on businesses. And I think we should be helping businesses and not pretending that all businesses are made of money, because many businesses are just scraping by.
Okay, and if people want to learn more, you can go to yang2020.com. We got 1,000 people asking us to try to justify the UBI and Andrew's for a VAT tax. You can find more about that on his website. Andrew, I have one Generation X gotcha question for you. Are you ready?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, fire away.
Atari, Intellivision, ColecoVision, or Nintendo?
I'm going to say Atari 2600 because that was the formative console of my youth. I can still remember the sound effect of that first Pac-Man cartridge, and it was a cartridge. So thank you for the question. I love it.
Not a bad answer. Yeah, that was 2600 was huge, but Intellivision changed the world, I think. But that's a debate for a different day. Andrew Yang, thank you. On Twitter, actually, what is your Twitter handle?
It's Andrew Yang, and I'm posting all the time. So if you want to follow me in the campaign, please follow me there. But let's make history and rewrite the rules so that it works for us and our families and will actually make us excited about the country we're leaving to them. It's up to us. No one else is going to do this.
Here we go. Andrew Yang, thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you both. Appreciate it. See you soon.